I have noticed a concerning tendency to excuse immorality on the grounds of cultural tolerance. It is just their culture. They just have different views. We should respect their values. Other cultures shouldn't be criticised. These idiotic sentiments are consistently made verbal whenever a liberal wants to virtue signal by defending inhumanity in a display of cultural tolerance. They seek to prove how tolerant and respectful they are by excusing cruelty on the basis of cultural tolerance. But how virtuous can a person really feel when their senseless tolerance openly excuses and outright justifies all the immorality in the world? It is just their culture. They just have different values. These sentiments justify anything and everything. Their logical endpoint is us respecting Nazism because it is just a different opinion, and respecting the Holocaust because it is just German culture. These notions of mindless tolerance are the fertilizers which propagate and permit the rationally detestable. They say we shouldn't criticize other cultures. If culture excuses small immoralities, it also excuses big ones. Invoke tolerance to defend the burqa or the circumcision, and soon you will be invoking tolerance to defend the honor killings and the child marriages. If culture excuses immorality, then culture excuses immorality. If cultures shouldn't be criticized, then cultures shouldn't be criticized. These sentiments apply as much to displays of Islamic homophobia and oppressive patriarchy as they do to slavery and genocide. If you truly believe in this amoral cultural tolerance, you believe that genocide and slavery ought to be tolerated. Such practices are fundamentally cultural, and if culture excuses immorality, it excuses them. These notions of tolerance exhibit an unmatched capacity to justify evil. There is not one depravity or inhumanity that they refrain from excusing. Like so much flawed reasoning, its downfall is in its logical conclusions. This detestable notion of tolerance, it excuses and permits the rationally detestable. It asks beings who can feel pain to tolerate the normalization of cruelty and brutality. It asks beings who can suffer to tolerate the corrosion of empathy and compassion. It asks sentient beings to tolerate the undermining of respect for sentience. It asks us to be irrational. This is an ask that we cannot and will not obey. I will not sacrifice my rationality on the altar of tolerance, just as I will not allow my tolerance to permit the sacrifice of a man on the altar of the sun god. The downfall of the argument is in its logical conclusions. This truth resurfaces again in the fundamental absurdity of this notion of tolerance. If all aspects of all cultures ought to be tolerated, then so too must be tolerated their own intolerance. There is nothing cultures exhibit more widely and more fiercely than an intolerance for one another. And when I say culture, I do not simply mean differences in food, clothing, language, holidays. As should be clear, the cultural division most central to this particular matter is the differences in values. All moral claims are claims about how people should behave, philosophical assertions about how people ought to act. They possess implied philosophic authority, implicit philosophical superiority. Each culture has its moral claims. Many of the moral claims of these cultures conflict with one another, and by their very nature, they possess an intolerance of their antithesis. One does not simultaneously consider something to be morally wrong and fine simultaneously. All cultures have their moral values, and these moral values are defined by intolerance. In this regard, cultures are fundamentally intolerant of each other. Preach tolerance and respect for all cultures and all their values, and you are excusing the forces that are contrary to your own tolerance. This reasoning is self-invalidating. It provides protection for the forces that will destroy it. Endless tolerance excuses and empowers intolerance. If all of the cultures and all of their values should be respected and tolerated, then naturally so too should their intolerant aspects be tolerated. The infamous paradox of tolerance. This reasoning is self-destructive on a fundamental level. Such tolerance excuses intolerance, and by doing so propagates the very conditions that will destroy it. Many questions come to mind when one faces these supporters of seemingly endless tolerance. Should we respect colonialism because it is merely a piece of British culture? Intolerance of other cultures is as much a piece of a culture as anything else is. If cultures are beyond criticism, if cultures ought to be tolerated and their values respected, then surely that applies also to their intolerance. This obsession with tolerance empowers the very things that will destroy it. If cultures shouldn't be criticized, if cultures should be given endless respect and not a bit of moral judgment, then colonialism can consider itself excused. Take just a moment to think about the logical conclusions of your reasoning. Colonialism was as much a part of British culture as the burqa is a piece of Islamic culture. This conception of tolerance that demands limitless respect and a complete lack of criticism and moral judgment. It is a cancer. It is a plague. It justifies and excuses the rationally detestable. It provides protection for rationally detestable ideas and practices. It creates conditions perfect for the propagation and spread of irrationally detestable and morally reprehensible ideas and practices. These notions of tolerance excuse the normalization of cruelty and brutality, corrosion of empathy and compassion, undermining of respect for sentience. These are things that no rational sentient being is willing to excuse. What next? Are we to tolerate the construction of the gallows from which we will be hung? Are we to tolerate Islamic culture as the executioner lops off our head? Are we to respect American culture as we see the American drone release its bombs overhead? They demand that we respect the rationally detestable. Rational beings will reject their demand. These lovers of tolerance. Never has a group been at once so unsure of their moral superiority and so overwhelmingly confident in it. They wouldn't dare to criticize the values of another culture, but they will scream at you about the importance of endless tolerance until they can scream no more. They demand that others doubt their moral judgment while exhibiting complete dogmatic confidence in their own judgment. They claim that we must restrain our moral judgment, all while releasing theirs on anyone who fails to practice their degree of mindless dogmatic cultural tolerance. These notions of tolerance are a plague, a cancer. Tolerance has its place. Some things should be tolerated. Differences in food, clothing, language, even some beliefs and social conventions. Some degree of tolerance can be massively valuable for enriching our own culture and ensuring that we have a stable society. But we should not give people's moral values endless and unlimited tolerance and respect. To do so is to create conditions ideal for the propagation of irrationally detestable ideas. Rational sentient beings will not allow cruelty to be normalized, empathy and compassion corroded, and respect for sentience undermined, out of a dogmatic need to respect the rationally detestable. Moral systems exist to serve the basis of reason. Moral systems that do that better are better moral systems. The basis of reason is of course our capacity for pain and pleasure. It is these forces that give everything else its meaning. It is these forces that dominate the sentient existence, define the sentient reality. Some systems serve the basis of reason better than others. They are superior moral systems. Some moral systems merely induce pleasure in the form of meaning or comfort. Others provide meaning and comfort, but they provide something more. A logical relationship with the basis of reason. They don't merely induce surface-level pleasure. Any moral system can do that. But only some can do so while also having a rational relationship with the basis of reason. It is these moral systems that are superior. The moral systems that have a logical connection to the basis of reason. The moral systems that have a rational relationship with our capacity for pain and pleasure. Following from consideration of that capacity for suffering, what is irrational if not the undermining of respect for sentience? The corrosion of empathy and compassion is not in the interest of a being who can suffer. The normalization of cruelty and brutality is not in the interest of a being who can suffer. These are simple maxims. They are maxims that facilitate the identification of superior and inferior values. They can and should be applied to the values and practices of each and every culture. Rational morality has many dimensions and considerations. It should be applied to every culture. All moral systems exist to serve the basis of reason, either by inducing surface-level pleasure in the form of meaning or comfort, or by pursuing a logical connection with the basis of reason in the form of a direct appeal to it. This can be seen in the religious notion of heaven and hell. Moral systems serve the basis of reason. Moral systems that do that better are better moral systems. This is a fundamental truth. This is an intolerant truth. Rational moral systems are exclusionary and intolerant in the best sense, in the sense that the filtering of water is intolerant and exclusionary. They reject rationally detestable ideas, as they should. Sentient beings should be intolerant of that which undermines respect for sentience. Beings who can suffer should be intolerant of that which corrodes empathy and compassion. Beings who can feel pain should be intolerant of that which normalizes cruelty and brutality. Such intolerance represents a logical relationship with the fundamental level of their being as sentient creatures. Righteous intolerance defines the rational moral system. This is not a matter of one culture over another. All cultures should be subject to rational judgment. All cultures should face merciless criticism and ruthless consideration. All cultures should be subject to the scrutinous gaze of reason. We must dispose of this hideous notion of unlimited tolerance and endless respect. We must discard this dogmatic stupidity. This thinking is rationally detestable. It excuses rationally detestable conduct. This form of tolerance is merely apathy disguised as virtue, amorality disguised as humanitarianism. When your highest value is tolerance, your only value is tolerance. and it is a self-destructive form of tolerance that excuses the intolerance that is its antithesis. Values and moral frameworks are not all equal. Some are superior, others are inferior. This hideous notion of tolerance denies that reality and justifies everything, including the rationally detestable. Female genital mutilation, honor killings, human sacrifice, rape, torture. There is nothing that this reasoning doesn't justify. All of these things are cultural. If we must have limitless respect for culture, if we must never subject culture to moral judgment, then we must permit and excuse these disgusting immoralities. When you think the highest virtue is tolerance, you sell out every other virtue immediately. This form of tolerance is morally disgusting, and I mean that in the strongest possible sense. This thinking excuses all the evil in the world when taken to its logical conclusion. That this thinking exists at all is indicative of the tragic fact that many people never learnt how to consider the logical conclusions of their beliefs. When all values are respected, none of them are. If you respect all the moral frameworks, you respect none of them. You need to pick your side because tolerance is not an option. Moral systems are fundamentally intolerant. They are claims about what ideas and behaviour are evil and wrong. If you respect moral systems, then by definition you respect intolerance, which makes your supposed tolerance absurd. Some people detest the supremacy narrative central to my morality. Moral claims are claims about how people should behave. They necessarily have implied philosophic authority, implicit philosophical superiority. Some people are scared to declare other ideas inferior. Such a thing is inherent to moralizing, and that is fine, so long as our claims to superiority have a strong philosophical basis. All moral claims are founded on implied philosophic superiority. I am just one of the few who is willing to admit it, and do the reasoning necessary to make that philosophic superiority a reality as opposed to a delusion. Anyone who makes moral claims engages in implied philosophic superiority. You can't make a claim about how people ought to behave without implying that you possess some degree of philosophic authority. Some people seem to detest the fact that I have acknowledged this reality and now consider it an overt and central part of my moralizing. They can detest my honesty all they want, just as I will detest their ignorance, delusion, and dishonesty. All moral claims have fundamental, implied superiority. I am only different in my honesty and awareness of this. This disgusts some, but I do not take it personally. My awareness has allowed me to embrace this reality and build my moral system around it. They say we should tolerate that harmful practice because it is just their culture. Where does this reasoning end? Do we excuse the Holocaust as German culture? What about chattel slavery as Southern culture? What about colonialism as British culture? Where does this stupidity end? If this variant of tolerance remains prevalent for much longer, it will soon drip with blood. It is already a philosophic justification of all the cruelty in the world. Do you think excusing and justifying all of the cruelty in the world is in the interest of one who can suffer? Do you think the idea that culture justifies cruelty is a smart thing for a being who can suffer to promote? It is often implied that something is just part of another culture and is therefore somehow justified. If culture justifies something, then everything is justified. Culture is defined as the social conventions and values of a group. These advocates of endless tolerance think we should respect ideas simply because a group believes them, and excuse practices simply because a group practices them. As if someone doing something is somehow a justification of that thing. This is circular logic at its worst. Support for the thing justifies support for the thing. Support for the practice is justified because people support it. Support for the idea is justified because people support it. This reasoning is blatantly circular. The belief gets its legitimacy, and therefore the justification for support, from its existence, which is itself founded on its support. This notion of tolerance and its implied justification is founded on circular logic. Support for the ideas and practices of a culture is justified by the support. Excuse the repetitive, messy nature of my ramblings. I am deeply irritated by this stupidity. This plague that has infected the worldview of so many liberals. This notion of tolerance is immoral. It is immoral because its primary function is to excuse immorality. I dream of the day that we cease to hear mention of this idiocy.